Daniel and David, and I'm going to remind everybody that to please mute yourself if you're not speaking, so that way we don't hear any errant sounds in the background. So Daniel, David, it's all yours, gentlemen.
Thank you, Greg. So as Greg mentioned, I'm Daniel Fox. I've been with Booz Allen Hamilton now roughly 7.5 years. I've been currently a program manager for a large-scale contract that we're doing within the intelligence community. Whereas Greg mentioned, we've got anywhere between 18 and 22 on average concurrent projects going on at any given time. So we have a lot of different types of projects, a lot of different types of content areas, a lot of different delivery mediums, a lot of different clients within that broad customer base. So hopefully there are things that we can cover in this presentation that will be of value for you. I've been involved in training mainly in technology-based learning solutions for the last roughly 20 years, doing a mixture of things for the commercial sector, the private sector, and so hopefully there'll be some things of value that we can provide in this session, and I'm going to let David Ziffer introduce himself.
Hi, I'm David Ziffer, and I've been with Booz Allen now for close to 7 years. I've been working on Daniel's team for about 5 years now, and I'll be providing the perspective of a project lead from a larger program, so that'll be where my insight's coming from. And as Greg mentioned, I am a student in the program. I'm actually in my last semester, and I'm looking forward to graduating in August.
Great. Excuse me. Yeah, thank you. So we want this to be really interactive, so feel free throughout to ask any questions. It's nice that it's a small, intimate group, so I think that allows us to be a little bit more informal and really just have kind of an open dialogue. And so if anything comes up, anything you want to sort of talk about or expand on, feel free to do that. So we're going to talk about trying to understand, it would be great to hear some of the challenges that you guys face in, being involved in learning solutions, with the focus on managing those projects and being involved in it from a project management perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about our overall approach and sort of philosophy to managing learning solutions. What are some of the lessons learned we've come across? What are some of our best practices? And throughout, we're going to be referring to kind of a scenario of, what happens in a typical kind of project that we see. So the things that we bring up are things, for the most part, that we've really come across. And as I mentioned, feel free to ask any questions that you have. And so we're going to go to the next slide. So we really think that there are three kind of cornerstones, if you will, in terms of having a successful project and basically making your client happy, because at the end of the day, that's kind of a critical component, because you want to have a good relationship with your client and you want it to be a collaborative scenario. And I feel very fortunate in the last several efforts that I've been involved in, but I do feel like it's a very collaborative effort. So the first thing is understanding what is the vision that the client has, and how is the client going to be measuring success? So how do you know from the client's perspective that you've done a good job, that you've met the expectations? So I think that's one of the critical elements. The other is managing their expectations. So we've seen that as a really important step, because if you don't set that expectation and manage that expectation all along the way, you can run into the scenario where the customer says, no, I didn't want, a farmhouse. I wanted a condo. I wanted something very different than what you provided, and you don't want that to obviously happen. So it's constantly checking in with the client, making sure that, what you're doing is in alignment with their expectations. And then along the way, sort of trying to identify and sort of look ahead at what are the potential risks up ahead and what can you do to sort of mitigate and navigate your way from those potential pitfalls. And there are a lot of pitfalls that happen along the way on learning projects. So I want to be able to sort of give you some of my lessons learned and some of the pitfalls I've gone through, and I think it's really helpful to going through these experiences. And sometimes you make mistakes, and as long as we learn from them, I think the customer's pretty forgiving.
And I think these are themes that really key that you really need to go back to throughout the entire project. It's not enough to just kind of address these up front. You need to constantly be reassessing, looking back at these, making sure that you're addressing these, because things change, client expectations change, risks occur throughout, and if you're constantly going back to it, it assures that it's a much smoother project.
Thanks, David. So on the next slide, this is sort of the life cycle based primarily on the ADDIE model. But it's really, doing your planning work and your scoping work. How do you scope out the effort? What do you expect during the kickoff meeting? Then obviously the analysis and design is your foundation. In this particular scenario, we've broken up the analysis and design into 3 levels. 3A is, a very high-level look at what the learning solution is. 3B is a more detailed dive, and in phase 3 is, in the case of a web-based training solution, for example, you would be doing some storyboards. And then these are the other aspects of developing it, how to implement it out there, what are some best evaluation strategies, and then ultimately closing out the project. So in phase 1, project planning and scoping, in scoping out a project, right, you've got to determine how much is this project going to cost, right? So you're going to a customer, they've come to you, and they said, we've got this problem. We have a problem with whatever it is. People aren't able to perform X, Y, or Z, or we have a new system we're rolling out, whatever it might be. They have some level of requirements, and they want to know what's it going to cost. How quickly can you get it done? And so at a lot of times, you really do not know all the data that you can know to provide a very detailed estimate that is going to hit sort of every nook and cranny. There's a fair number of assumptions that we make, and it's important to document those assumptions. So usually we have some level of an upfront meeting with the client, get an understanding of what is it that they're looking for, trying to have a discussion with them on, they may think they want instructor-led training. In a discussion, you may think it's web-based training, but you want to come to some meeting of the minds related to that. And part of that is, getting into, and there's some questions that I know you guys have raised in terms of, what's it like to be a consultant? And part of being a consultant is, looking at what they're asking for and determining whether that's really the right approach. And sometimes at the very early on phase, when you're just starting, you may not know all the answers to make a good, recommendation. But you want to know what's the seat time? How long are, they come to you and they say, we think this is a day's worth of training, or whatever those things are. You're going to get some assumptions. You're going to ask a lot of questions. But at the end of the day, you're going to want to put together a document that sort of talks about this is what we think the deliverables are. This is some initial assumptions that we're going to make. These are what we think the deliverables are. And what I generally do is those assumptions, I'll go to the client and I'll say, look, here's our assumptions. And based on these assumptions, this is what we're thinking it's going to, how long it's going to take. This is how long it's going to cost. Now, with that said, we have a real caveat here that once we start going through the analysis and the design phase, we are going to want to revisit those assumptions that we used to come up with our costing and our scheduling and say, so which of these assumptions still remain true? And if the assumptions aren't necessarily in line with what you've come out through in your analysis and design phase, and once you start doing your research and yada yada, then you need to relook at the cost and the schedule. So if we go to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, the client may be settled on a specific deliverable. You should be able to provide some suggestions, but being a good consultant is sort of understanding the balance between making recommendations and not, necessarily saying to them, well, no, that's not how it's going to be. It needs to be this. So you have to sort of find that balance act of, how to give it, a good, good college try of recommendations, but you obviously don't want to be too authoritative and tell them this is how it's going to be, or else that's going to turn them off.
And just on that note, it's partly just about educating the client. They may have heard about a specific solution because they saw it somewhere or they know somebody who used it, and they don't know that that may not be the ideal solution for this specific project. So you want to kind of have a discussion and get an idea of what they're hoping the training will accomplish. So for example, if they want to have a training on some sort of computer system and they want people to be able to interact with it, and they're talking about having a flash course, you might let them know that something like Captivate might be the ideal solution because that's what it's built for. So really kind of having that discussion and letting them know what the different options are is pretty important at this point.
So on the next slide, those assumptions. So some of the assumptions that we look at is the content that we're training on, is it stable or is it going through changes? Do they have existing materials, existing documentation, and is the documentation relevant? Is it accurate? What's the delivery solution that we think is the right delivery solution? What's the degree of interactivity that we're going to put in this course? Are we thinking this is the kind of course that requires a lot of interactivity to engage the learner and to provide the highest level of retention? Or do we think this is something that's more awareness training and you don't need that level of interactivity? What's the assessment strategy? Are there, is there going to be a very robust assessment strategy because you need to test them and you need to understand what those results are, and the test has certain implications? How many reviews are you going to give the client? How long are they going to review things? Do they have SMEs? Are the SMEs available? When are they available? How long is the course going to take somebody to go through it end to end? Who are all the stakeholders, who are going to have a say in this course? So these are all, this is just a sampling of some of the assumptions, but those assumptions are going to drive kind of what the solution is. Do we have a question?
Yes.
Sure.
Hi, so it's Allie here. Hi guys. Thanks for coming. My question is about all this work that we're doing to document the project. Are you looking at the project as, I guess, would you do the same work for each course if you were thinking there was going to be a module or 5 modules to effectively do what the client wants? Would you create a plan for each of the 5 modules, or is there like a big plan and then each of the modules has little mini plans?
So that's a good question. Thank you, Allie. So for example, if it's a course, right, if it's a course and the course is made up of several modules, that project plan is going to encompass the whole thing. So for example, the project plan is typically, if it's modules, even if it's a blended learning solution, we're going to have certain assumptions that typically are going to transcend or encompass all those modules. We don't typically come up with a new project plan for each of those modules. Now, if those modules are separate efforts, they're separate pots of money, that might be something different. And I am going to talk a little bit later on about, the spiral model that sometimes we follow, and that's where you're kind of doing, releases, in a more micro kind of way. But most of the solutions that we do it's a full course, and there's several modules, and does that answer your question? I know, because sometimes people think in terms of modules, sometimes people think in terms of lessons, and that's a whole other topic that we go into too, in terms of if it's SCORM compliant. Does everybody know what SCORM is? I'm assuming that you do, but if you don't, that's a term that I just used.
Yes.
Okay. So we have sometimes that debate in terms of, are we doing these SCOs at the lesson level, at a module level? So anyway, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I see, I can follow what you're doing as you're driving this now, and I've started thinking, in some of the things I've been involved in, there've been aspects that were very specifically like e-learning modules, Captivate modules and stuff that were separate from creating some instructor-led or some other online job aids and things like that different people would be involved in, and the groups that would help with them are so different that it almost feels like separate projects, but there really is one project of dealing with this client on this rollout.
Right, and sometimes, like what you just said, is sometimes there are dependencies on these tasks that people are working that may be very independent. So, does one need to be, is one thing dependent upon another thing, or are they completely independent, right? So.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks.
A few things on that assumptions document. Really getting those assumptions down up front and then throughout it serves a number of purposes. For one, it's kind of your guide through the project. It also lets the client see what actually goes into the project all the way through, so they can constantly be referencing that. And kind of one of the key things about the assumptions document is that if later on there's issues with scope or the client wants to make changes that will really have an impact on the project, you can go back to that assumptions document and kind of say, we had these assumptions up front, and what you're suggesting is really outside of scope, and how do we want to address that? But having something documented that they can see that they signed off on early on is pretty helpful. And it actually might be beneficial for you to keep an internal assumptions document for yourself, just for the team to keep track of, how many resources you have, their level of, when they're going to be off, the degree of skill, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point, because I can tell you on the contract that I manage, the program, we have all these different projects going on, and it's not atypical that the customer will say, oh yeah, well, I'd like this or I'd like that. And, it's very difficult to, and this goes back to a question somebody asked me, I think it was Maureen. You asked, what is the most challenging part of being a consultant? I think the biggest challenge is, and something that I talk to the folks on my team, so I've got about 34 people on my team who are supporting these projects, and one of the biggest challenges is getting our project leads to not say no to the client. That's a big challenge. So the client asks you, can you do, hey, you know what, I'd like this new component added to the course, and they don't even think of it as a new component. Hey, can you make, the course menu do, show, which screens somebody has gone through in addition to topics, or any number of things the client could ask you for. And so, the project lead is looking at the schedule and saying, I know you want this done, and now you're asking for this, and, if you say no to them, then there's an appearance that you're not flexible. So one of the things of advice that I give to our project leads is, avoid saying no. What I recommend is saying, look, obviously anything's possible. Let me go back. Let me see what's involved, and I'll get back to you. So we're looking at seeing, is it possible to provide this? Is it not possible to provide this? And also going back to, as David mentioned, those assumptions documents and saying, look, this is what we assumed, and, unfortunately, we can't do this now. We could potentially revisit it later on in the project to see if we're ahead of schedule or see any of those kinds of things that can help out. But, it's a balancing act. And so, yeah, I think a challenge is sometimes saying no to a client. It can be very difficult. And sometimes you do have to say no. So I want to make that clear, too. So on the next slide, here's the scenario. So you've had an initial meeting with the client, and the following are the list of assumptions that have come out of the meeting, right? So the first thing is they've decided this training thing is they want training on a system that they've got, right? It's a new system, a new tool that all the folks need to be using, and the system is very stable. It's not going to be having any changes in the near future. They have a dispersed workforce, and for a multitude of reasons, which I'm not going to get into right here and now, but WBT is the right solution. And we think it's going to take 2 hours for somebody to go from A to Z to complete that course. It's going to go into a learning management system. It needs to be SCORM compliant and 508 compliant. The training should be level 3 interactivity. So we look at different levels of interactivity in our courses. So some courses, you've probably heard this expression, they're page turners. Page turner is basically the student clicks next, and I think us as instructional designers and practitioners are not highly keen on page turners because they're not interactivity. They don't, people just click next. It's not a very engaging experience for the most part. This course is level 3, so it has a fair amount of interactivity, and the customer wants it done in 6 months. So does anybody have any questions so far? Anything you want to add? Okay.
Daniel, this is Craig.
Go to the next slide.
Daniel, it's Craig. I was just wondering if you talked about giving them the initial estimate on the price, and then when you go, you kind of reserve the right to, when you go to the analysis, then to say, well, you're like, whoa, we found something that has changed or isn't quite exactly what we thought it was going to be. Have you ever had a client say, once you tell them, and then this will take X more hours, and therefore Y, Y more dollars? Have you ever had a client say at that point, well, oh, well, then we don't want you to do it, or what typically happens at that point? I'm just curious in your experience.
Yeah, it's a good question, and no, I haven't had a client say no. They may say to me, I don't care. I want you still to do those dollar amounts, and within the schedule, that's your problem, right? So, but for the most part, I think the customers are pretty reasonable, and I think that's why the assumptions are pretty important. So a lot of times what you'll see the client will want, and you may do this too, is, so for example, we have here in the assumptions, it's going to take 2 hours for someone to go through this course, right? Mm-hmm. And so we figure that out because we think based on the level, the amount of content and whatever else it is. So what we'll do sometimes is we'll have a range, which gives some wiggle room, right? So we'll price it out. So the fact is, okay, we think it's going to be 2 to 2.5 hours or 2 to 3 hours. That way, there's a range. So that's a kind of a good strategy because it's good for both you and it's good both for the customer. Because it's not a great thing to go back to the customer and say, I want more money. I don't like to do that. and the customer doesn't particularly like it. So having a range gives you some leeway in the sense that we think it's going to be, somewhere between 2 to 3 hours in length. That means we're probably going to cost it out, that it could be 3 hours. That way, if it's 2 hours, well, so be it. In some scenarios, there are projects where it's, it's a level of effort, project, so they only time and materials or something. So it's basically whatever you do is what you charge. So if you get it done in 3 months rather than 4 months, it's a savings to the customer, as opposed to there are other kinds of contracts that are firm fixed price contracts where it's like, hey, we want you to build this solution, and we're going to pay you, I'm just going to throw out a number here, $100,000 to do this, and then the contractor, we absorb the risk. So if it turns out that it's going to take a lot more than what we anticipated, doesn't matter. It's a firm fixed price contract. You have to deliver it within a dollar amount, and there's no ends, ifs, or buts. Whereas the time and materials contract, they pay for what you do, and so there's more risk on the client side, because if you tell them it's going to be $100,000 and it ends up being $200,000, technically, the customer has to, pay that. Now, obviously, I'm broad stroking it a bit, and there's discussions that happen, but that's sort of the way it goes. But as we go through the slides here, we are going to run into some scenarios where the assumptions change, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we do then.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, so we are on the kickoff slide, and in this phase, this is where we're really getting the requirements. We're identifying who are the stakeholders. We're introducing the client to, some of the key people on our project team. So maybe the lead instructional designer, maybe the lead graphic artist. We sort of ask them to bring existing documentation that they have. Want to talk to them about what's the best way you want to communicate. Or do you want, do you want to meet once a week? Do you want to meet biweekly? Do you want to meet over the phone? Do you want to meet in person? What's the best communication method that you prefer? Also want to talk about, what's the review process that they want to have, and kind of review those assumptions that we did when we were costing this thing out. And then the deliverable is going to be a schedule/project plan, which lists what are the tasks, what are the resources. So we've got to identify who those resources are, what are the skill sets, how long is each of these tasks going to take, and then we're also, at the end of this, as we, as I think is a good practice along the way when you're meeting with the client, is to have meeting minutes. Unfortunately, having a CYA document is very important. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon how you look at it. But that can be a very important thing. In addition to that, it's also good to start keeping up a list of action items. So this is the action item that came out of this meeting. This is who's assigned to it. So some of the action items may be on your client side, right? The client needs to provide something. The subject matter expert needs to provide something, or you need to provide something. And when are you going to provide it by? And when did you actually provide it? So having that action log is a really good mechanism, in addition to the schedule, to make sure things are happening, and people are, there's a responsibility kind of deal that goes with that. So who's accountable?
And just piggybacking off of what Daniel was saying, you really can't document enough. You can't have enough meeting minutes. It's really important to consistently be sending the client any communication, and just making sure that you have it documented, because some projects go on for a long time and clients can forget what happened, and you want to be able to go back and say, well, based on our understanding at this stage of the project, this is what we were assuming, and you don't have to come back and it's your word against their word. So having that documentation is important. And just going back to the kickoff meeting in general is also really important, that it can really set the tone for the project. So you need to come as prepared as possible for that meeting. You may want to do some research on relevant topics beforehand so you can show that you're really committed to the project. You want to be prepared to ask relevant questions. You want to potentially have some samples of things. Basically, you want to let them know up front that you're as committed to this as possible, and that can set a positive tone for the rest of the project.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think in that kickoff meeting, you're really establishing your credibility, right? So knowing that you've got a team behind you, you've already put some initial thoughts into it, like David said. I think those are all pretty key things. And getting back to the point that David made in terms of meeting minutes, I can tell you, it's not that atypical that you have a project lead that you're supporting on, your client side, whoever your customer is, and the customer changes, right? So somebody, leaves whatever company they're at, or they get a different position, and the new person says, well, why did you do X, Y, or Z? And you say, well, that's what the person told me to do. Well, do you have that documented? How do I know that that's the case? So these meeting minutes can be helpful. Got a question? Go ahead.
Rolanda had a question. Is there someone who should receive the communication prior to sending it to the client? Can anyone on the team communicate with the client directly?
That's a really good question too. Can anybody communicate to the client directly? So I'm going to, before I give you my 2 cents, I'm going to put that back out to the group and get your guys' impressions. What do you all think? So you've got a project, you've got multiple people who are working on the project. Should people be able to go directly to the client and have the customer and have conversations? And under what circumstances? What do you guys think?
This is Allie. It's very dangerous. It needs to be really clear internally in your assumptions amongst your team beforehand to talk about who's going to talk to the client and about what things, and make those very clear among your team, because a lot of problems can happen with misunderstandings when you allow somebody who might not have the big picture or see the whole thing, communicating or miscommunicating, 2 different people saying 2 different things. So it becomes really important to know and just decide up front who's going to be talking to the client in what ways.
Anybody else have a thought on that?
William actually said, no one person should be the conduit for consistency purposes.
Yeah, so I'm going to weigh in this. Yes, generally I agree with both of you. Single point of contact is important. It's also always good to have a backup in case, you get hit by a car and croak or something. But beyond that, I think one of the things that I've learned is while there should be a single point of contact, it's also helpful for people in many of the scenarios I've been in. You have project teams, and you have somebody who wants to lead a project in the future. So it's really important that the team begin to grow skills, if they're so interested in learning how to, deal, work, and communicate with the client. So what I do in many situations is, if we're going over the interface design or we're having a meeting, I'll have the lead graphic artist talk the client through the interface design. I may have the programmer or an instruction, the instruction designer obviously should be talking through the storyboards or talking through, the content that you're developing. But I think it's important to, expose your client to your team for the most part. But yeah, I do think a single person is important, because what happens sometimes, and we've seen that on our work, is the customer goes directly to somebody on your team for a multitude of reasons, and it might not be something that you've agreed to. So they may go to your graphic artist and say, hey, look, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. Well, the graphic artist isn't looking at necessarily the big scale the big picture schedule. Sometimes they are. I mean, but there's a risk in that.
And just on the topic of statuses and assumptions, William mentioned, I send all stakeholders a dashboard that highlight current statuses and any issues that may cause a delay. This is sent on a monthly basis and discussed in our meetings.
Good. So let's see, what's the other thing I was going to mention. So we'll go to the next slide. Kickoff topic examples. And this is just kind of a lot of the things we've talked about. The one thing that I would add on here that's in bold is, especially with customers who are new to web-based training or the delivery mediums that you're doing, I think it's important up front in your kickoff meeting to let them see these are the kinds of deliverables you're going to get on this project. This is what a design plan document looks like. These are what storyboards look like. So they understand what to expect, what to be looking at, what to be focusing on, and also making sure, does this meet your expectations? Because they could look at your design plan document and go, you know what, there's not much to this. This is a lot of fluff. I want you to provide more detail than what I'm seeing here. So again, it gets back to setting the expectations.
And Allie had a question.
Okay.
When do you discuss the assumptions regarding ownership of code or proprietary rights on coursework?
Ownership of code. So with our government clients, they own the code. So when we're done with the project, they have the code. So now that doesn't mean they can give, all your intellectual, property away, but for the most part, they own the code, and it's probably different. It's been a while since I've worked in the private sector, and that is a little bit different. They may not own the code, but to be honest with you, one of the things that a lot of clients are looking for is they're looking for things they can update. They're looking for solutions that they're not dependent upon company X or company Y. So, getting into proprietary things, they'd rather have things, that's sort of the whole evolution of things like HTML and, XML, JavaScript, all those things, they don't want proprietary things because they don't want to be dependent upon one contractor. Okay. So here's an update to our scenario. Warning, what is it, Bill Robbins?
Will Robbins?
Will Robinson, thank you. For anybody who's old enough to know Lost in Space, or as David told me, he's seen it in the rerun, so it makes me feel better. So after the kickoff meeting, so now the client is saying reviews will be conducted by both the client and the SMEs. So what that's translating to in our scenario is, let's say, for example, I give a storyboard or design plan document to my customer. The customer says, okay, I want the SME to review it first, make any changes, and then once he or she gives you that feedback and you make the changes, I want to review it. So we're talking about, let's say the client gives each a week. So that's a week for one group, the client or the SMEs, to review it. Then you got to make the changes, and then another round of reviews by the other party. So you're up to 2+ weeks, right, for reviews. And then, as that second bullet is saying, it's not concurrent. Then the third bullet is you've got multiple SMEs, right? So you've got several different SMEs who are looking at this from maybe different parts of the organization or whatever. And so in our assumption, we are going to gather all of the feedback from the SMEs and then meet with them to deconflict their various, feedback. So you might have SME 1, 2, and 3, and they all have different perspectives. So you're going to need to somehow consolidate and deconflict that feedback, and that's going to take some time. Any questions so far on that? Okay, so now here's our list of assumptions so far, and you can see the new ones that we just added on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. We'll go to the next one here. Okay, schedule and the project plan. So we talked about the kickoff. Now we're, let's see here. We're looking at your project schedule. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but one of the things you want to make sure is what are those dependencies and relationships between tasks, and that came up earlier, right, with the discussion of maybe there's different modules. Are there dependencies on some of those modules? You want to make sure there's some padding in the schedule. So I can tell you right now, we have some customers who will say, okay, I only need 1 day to review something. I'm typically not a huge fan of only putting 1 day to review something, because then if that person is out sick or something happens, then my schedule's already off. So, and even though it's their issue because they, they weren't there and they said they were going to be able to do that, I want to make sure we have some padding. So it's important to pad your schedule, pad your estimates. Now that's not me saying, hey, if you think something's going to take, a week to do, you're going to add another week onto it. But it means, if you think something's going to take 3 days to do, you may want to have another day in there for a pad. So I think that's important. You also want to make sure you factored in the holidays, vacation schedules. I don't know how many of you have had this, but you've got a schedule, everything's good, and then you realize, oh, Joe Schmo has got a vacation planned, and they're supposed to do your graphics, and now what are you going to do? So you want to sort of try to plan out as much as you can to anticipate some of those things, and also anticipate what are some of the risks that could happen, right? So you might want to be thinking about, if you've got one graphic resource on this, you might want to be interviewing other graphic resources so you have some other people who might be available who you can think about in case of a scenario where, somebody leaves your team or something else happens.
Yeah, and just on that point, I mean, projects there are always things that are unexpected. You really can't factor everything in up front. And it really is important to have those strategies. Some clients might be more forgiving if there's an issue that's on their end, for example, if their systems are down or something like that. But they're typically less forgiving on something on your end. So while you may, somebody may have left the team, that puts you in a difficult predicament, but the client doesn't really care about that. They just want to make sure it's done on time. So having strategies to address any of these things is pretty key.
Any questions, thoughts, comments? All right. We will move on to phase 3, the analysis. That's where you're, working with your SMEs. You have a fair amount of SME involvement in this phase because you're determining, right, what are the learning objectives at a high level, who's your target audience, are there prerequisites for the training, are there technical requirements you need to know about, are there people who have low bandwidth? We have a solution we're developing right now where there are people who are out on ships. How are they going to get the training? What's the right delivery medium? This is basically the general blueprint, and we provide them a high-level analysis plan. These are iterative reviews, so all along the way, we want to make sure we're on the right track. You might want to start identifying who's the pilot audience. We, really think it's good to pilot what you're doing with a representation of your sample audience to make sure it's, aligned to what you want the solution to do. So getting to the point of identifying what's the right delivery medium, I'm going to refer back to some of the questions that we received because I've got some that are very specific to this topic. So from Candace, I have the question, what types of instructional technology do you prefer to use for blended projects? I'm going to tell you my thoughts, and David, I'd like to hear what you have to say on that. I don't have a huge preference. when we use a blend, it really depends on what the blend is. So we do some blends where there's a mixture of a virtual classroom like we're doing tonight, followed by some web-based training. There might be some job aids. So, I don't really have a huge preference. One of the things I do like is I do like Blackboard. I like Blackboard because you can integrate web-based training tutorials. You can also have threaded discussions where people can chat and instructors can sort of facilitate. So I think it's kind of an interesting learning management system or learning content management system of sorts. But all these things have their limitations and their benefits.
And I think it's important just to make sure that blended learning is the right solution. You have a lot of clients who hear about blended learning and it seems like the right solution, but when it comes down to it, it might not be the right approach. And we put together blended learning and found out that they couldn't get instructors, so they wanted to turn it into WBT afterwards. So it's important that it really is the right solution. And it's not just because it's in vogue or it's cool or whatever.
Yeah, and by the way, what we're seeing is there's a fair amount of customers who conceptually like blended learning solutions, but if they don't have instructors and they don't have people to help facilitate the synchronous aspect of a blended learning solution, then they're going to want self-paced. So we see a huge movement, if you will, for people wanting web-based training, and we do talk with them and try to get them to do more of a blend because web-based training is not always the perfect solution, and I almost see the pendulum has swung to clients who have historically only wanted instructor-led and a classroom setting to wanting only web-based training. So there's got to be some sort of middle ground, but as David mentioned, it's really what's the right solution for the problem. So we have a question or a comment?
William said we are required to demo to supervisor and managers so the material signed off on and allows them to see what their employees will see. In addition, they can provide insight on certain tasks or suggest items that should be stressed. And then he continues saying the tax department is big on seeing our demos due to tax laws that need to be covered.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Anybody else have any questions? The other one I have here is, this is from Michelle. Am I saying your name correctly? Are you there, Michelle Allen?
I'm not sure her audio is working.
Okay, so I'm going to take that as a yes. What has your experience been with government's client being receptive to blended learning as a training solution? So I think is security classified information a challenge with blended learning? I think, like I said, conceptually they're pretty good with blended learning, but as I said, I see a fair amount of them wanting, hey, let's just do web-based training because mainly they don't have the instructors to provide that synchronous or the instructor facilitated. And then this other question I have here is, how does Booz Allen choose the right blended approach for its government clients? What are the crucial questions that need to be answered? So I'm going to give you some of the ones that come to my mind. And, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to ask the class. So does anybody in the class want to take a stab at that? How do you choose what's the right blended learning solutions for your clients? Come on, I know you guys have probably all kinds. How about Maureen? Are you there? I'm not opposed to calling names now that I have them associated with the questions.
That's good. I like that. Ask them.
Maureen, come on. Come on down. The price is right. How about William?
Not sure if his audio is working either.
Come on.
Yolanda says location and
We're building the bridge to the 21st century here. Go ahead, David.
Rolanda said location and experience.
Location experience, that's good. I would also add, or did you get some more?
William actually.
William, let's go.
He said, we ask what type of access they have and the time they can allocate to training. If it is theory-based, we will suggest C.
Mm-hmm. C.
At my, this is Allie, at my work I try very hard to make sure I know what the audience is first. Number one, knowing who it is that's getting the training, not, because a lot of times what people at the level that are asking you to build it don't necessarily have a clear understanding of the skill level of the people that are going to receive it. And then after I know who the audience is, I worry about the technology and whether or not the solution can be delivered the way they're asking.
Yep, absolutely. Those are good points.
Vivian had an answer.
Okay.
It will be determined by their organizational capabilities, the audience, the best fit.
Yep. So I look at, is the audience dispersed or centrally located? Is it a one-time training event, or is it going to be recurring, training opportunities on whatever it is? Is the content stable? Is it, complicated kind of material? Does it, do you need to have it, would collaboration and working with others be critical for the way you want to deliver the instruction? I'm trying to think of some of the other things that I look at in terms of the delivery medium. Obviously, access to technologies that they have. So there's a multitude of different things that that we look at. Okay.
And William's answer actually got cut off. He was saying that if it's theory-based, we'll suggest CBTs, but if it's accounting-related with mathematics need to be covered, where mathematics need to be covered, ILT will be used.
Mm-hmm.
And Alice mentioned longevity of content.
Yep, absolutely.
And there was actually a question a little bit earlier from Candace.
Okay.
Who wanted to know, when working with SMEs, what are the ways in which you get information from them?
What are the ways we get information from SMEs? So we get information from SMEs in a couple of different ways. I've done sort of over the shoulder and sort of watching them do their work. I don't know that we've found that to be all that helpful, just because sometimes there's a lot of downtime, or it's just for whatever reason it doesn't always work out. But we do that some of the time. We do interviews. We do focus groups. We do surveys.
Captivate sessions are actually, if you're getting training on systems, to have an interview and hear about the different buttons doesn't really mean anything if you're seeing out of context. So if you can sit down and capture a Captivate where they're speaking and clicking through the screens, you can go back afterwards and look at that and just learn everything you need to from that. So Captivate's a great tool for SME sessions.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm on phase 3. We're in phase 3B, the detailed design plan, where we get into a lot more details, into the step-by-step, what's going to happen in this course, what are the, not only the terminal objectives, but the enabling objectives. We'll mock up an interface. If it's a WBT, we'll really get into the assessment strategies. Is there a mediation strategy if somebody doesn't pass the test? And it's really important that this detailed design plan, is reviewed with the people who are going to be taking this detailed design plan and running with it. So your other instructional designers, they in on it, your artists, programmers, you know, hey, is what you're designing out here doable? Can they do this? What are some of the issues that they may have? So you want their buy-in. And then you're obvious, this is the best place where we have this caveat on, relook at what those assumptions are and see whether they still are valid. And if they're not, then you have to have a discussion with the customer. I'm going to go on to the next page. Then we move on to storyboards. In each of these phases, we give the client the deliverables or the outputs that you saw on the slide, and we get their feedback along the way. In the storyboards, that's where we're really detailing out screen by screen. If it's a WBT, and the example we're using right now is a WBT, it's going to be different, obviously, if it's an instructor-led training. But screen by screen, what should they be looking at? What's the instructional text? If there's audio, what's the audio script? What's the graphics that they should be looking at? Screen by screen, because you want the customer to review this prior to going to production, because changes at this phase are much easier to make than they are down the road. Question?
Sherry has a question.
All right, Sherry.
When do you typically bring the designer or design team into the project? And kind of as we're mentioning, I think you really want to bring them in as early as possible once you really have an idea of what the project's going to be about, to make sure that they can do everything that you're envisioning. Just because you're able to do something on a different project doesn't necessarily mean it'll work here. And unless you have the expertise in the programming or the graphics or whatever it is, you really want to make sure that they're reviewing everything along the way and signing off on that. And just on the point Daniel was mentioning about the storyboard review, it's really important that you relay to the client how crucial this review is. I've worked on projects where clients kind of fly through the storyboards because they think they'll have a chance to see it again later in the program version, not factoring in that you've recorded audio, you've synced up animations, and all these other things that take a significant amount of time, and now they come back with significant changes to the content. You now need to go back and redo all that audio, sync it up again, and it adds a lot of time. So just letting them know up front, here's the reason why we need you to do this crucial review at this point. It can save a lot of time later on.
All righty. So, next slide. So here we go. Look at Mr. Headache. Mr. Headache is like, oh my God, you know what? We went through this design phase, and now we've met with the SMEs and we've looked at the content. This is no longer looks like 2 hours worth of content. It looks like it's 3 hours worth of content. Okay, class, what are the options? Anyone? How about, let's see, let's look at the list of the class roster. You guys are going to hate me after this, aren't you? How about Mr. Banks? I know you don't have your microphone working, but maybe you can text us some thoughts. Anybody wants to chime in? I'm sure.
Well, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we actually ran into this problem early in the year with one of the classes that we were developing for financial reporting. And what we did was we went back to the business, we explained the situation, because it dealt with different types of simulations that they wanted covered, and we wanted to make sure that the attendees had enough time to go through them. And what they had told us is they didn't want the class to go beyond 10 to 12 due to the fact that they had other deliverables they had to deal with in the afternoon. So by explaining the situation, they agreed upon that we will actually break the class over 2 days. So what we did was we offered the class, it was actually for 2 weeks, Tuesday, Wednesday, 10 to 12, took care of half the group, and then we brought the other group for the following 10 to 12 from the Tuesday, Wednesday, and they're perfectly fine with that.
Wow, that's good. David, did you have a comment? Anybody else?
Rolanda actually said that you can propose a second course for the future.
Second course for the future. That's a good suggestion.
This is Sherry. I guess couldn't you create like pre-work or post-work to follow up on the course so that they're doing some more things on their own?
Good. So if you do pre-work, post-work, that's still going to involve more work, right? Because that's,
yeah.
What's that?
I mean, you'd have to present your options and just, map out a couple different plans, but, it's just going to take more work, and you're going to have to present that to the client.
Right, absolutely. So we're going to go look at the next slide with some ones that we've come up with. And we've had this scenario, so this is not a scenario that's new. Go ahead. What is the other one?
Oh, and Allie had a comment that you can ask the client to limit some of the content, prioritize it, or if needing all, rewrite the project with the enhancements.
Yep, that's a really good point. So on the next slide, these are some of the options that we thought about, but I think what I heard from the class are all good. One is change the course from a level 3 interactivity to a level 2 interactivity. Obviously, one of the options is, hey, look, we're going to need more money, and we're going to need more schedule time. I mean, that's obviously the easy answer, right? It's easy, so to speak. I mean, not necessarily it's easy to go to the customer and say, you know, I want more money, but it's the easy solution, right? It's not particularly a creative solution, right? But that's one of the solutions. The other is, you know, in addition to them wanting it, you know, that adding those extra time is going to lengthen out the schedule. One of the things that you can do to mitigate the schedule getting extended is we can have some of those reviews happen concurrently. So instead of the SMEs reviewing it and then the customer reviewing it, or vice versa, you're having both reviews done in parallel. Another thing that's taking time in the schedule, which takes time and costs money, is the level of effort in deconflicting all those 3 different SMEs feedback. So having a lead SME consolidate that feedback for you is another way to sort of streamline the effort.
And on that point, Allie actually says, I love it, making them do some of the extra work for you. And
it's an option.
Well, there's also one thing you have to understand is it depends on where your clients are based. For example, at the bank, all our clients are internal clients. So we service 6 different lines of business under fund accounting administration, which would be different if your client was outside the company.
Right.
What we do is we create a curriculum for each line of business. So these classes are mandated to be taken. So if it expands from 2 to 3 hours, they're going to have to take it. And the idea about having them do prep work, that could be beneficial for some companies, but I know for the banks I work at, they don't have enough time to do that. And since it's a proprietary system, they can't actually take our CBTs on their home computers. So they're pretty much left to do it at work, and with their time being so involved with trying to get the NAVs out into the stock market, it doesn't give them a lot of flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one of the key things, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of having that assumptions document throughout. And this is where you really be going back and looking at all the different assumptions and sitting down with the client and saying, okay, well, here's what we're assuming at this point. What here can be changed? And ideally, you could try to come to some sort of solution that, you know, to cut things down somewhat if you know, extending it or adding more resources is not an option.
Anybody else?
This is Allie. Yeah, this is Allie. I wanted to say one of the things that I'm not a clinician, but I work for a clinical organization, and one of the things that I learned by working there was that it's not just a straight dollar for time. When we bring staff out of the field and into the classrooms for face-to-face learning, for example, you have to pay them for that time, but you also have to pay somebody to do the work that they would have been doing in the field, like per diem nurses to cover them. So it's like very expensive to, you know, it's not a small increment to say it's going to be, we're pulling them out of the field for 3 hours or for a whole day versus a half day. It's a big change for them, that it's a big financial implication as well as resource managing for them.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Any others? Okay. We're moving on to phase 4 development. This is where you're obviously developing your learning content, your graphics, your programming. One of the things that you can do is, which we typically do, is we have the client review modules as they're being designed and developed, as opposed to waiting till the end of having them all done. So obviously you're getting feedback along the way, and that's generally the approach we take. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, we do a spiral development where we'll develop a module, you know, we'll design it, we'll program it, and then we'll pilot it. And And then while that module is being piloted, we're working on the next set of modules. So all these different approaches have their, their pros and cons, but generally it's much more effective to have your client review things along the way as opposed to you giving them everything and 4 months down the road, them looking at it and saying, no, this isn't what I wanted.
And one thing you want to do at this phase is to ensure that you have regular meetings with your project team, maybe on a weekly basis, just to keep everyone up to date and let everyone know that keep everyone on the same page. As the lead, there's the potential that you kind of get caught up with things and forget to relay information to everybody else. So kind of having that set time to let everybody know what you're hearing from the client, what you're hearing from the different members of the team, letting everybody discuss things is important, and it's usually appreciated by all the project team members as well.
Great. So the next slide is mitigating risk. So this is, what is assess risk? You should assess risk. Risk. Oh, you fixed it on that one. On my sheet, there's no S in risk. Okay. So throughout your project, you should step back, look at what are the risks. Always sort of look at what are the potential risks. That's something that I think a lot of project, managers who are managing learning solutions. And somebody asked me this question, so I'm going to ask it now because we're talking about managing risks. And, managing risks is a big part of project management. And somebody asked me, this is Allie, did you think your certification in PMP was a valuable investment of your time? Would you recommend it for learning professionals in general? I don't know if everybody knows what the PMP is. That's Project Management Professionals. It's through a group called PMI. And it basically certifies you as a, ordained project management professional, if you will. And in the government spaces, at least, on a lot of contracts, they look as a requirement that the program manager have their PMI certified, or they have their PMP certification. So I found it, well, I had to do it because I needed to do it for the contract. I found that it had some level of benefits to it. It makes you think about some things that maybe you don't always think about in terms of risks and things you should be thinking about and how to mitigate what they call gold plating and adding on things to a project that really shouldn't be there, and how to avoid some risks. But there's also a component of it that's fairly like memorizing things and using the vernacular of PMI that sort of like you memorize and you retain to take the PMI test, and then, you forget it quickly because a lot of it doesn't really pertain to some of the things that you do. So I found it to be a mixed bag. Allie, do you have your PMP, or did you have some thoughts on that? I'm just curious, what was the context for your question?
No, I don't have it, but I have seen, and over the course of taking the class, we've had a number of people that are PMP certified, and so this course has made me think about it, and I started thinking, well, maybe it would be worth doing, So yeah. I'm more on the side of more than 50% thinking towards maybe I would explore that option sometime here in the near future. And knowing, I'm glad you said what you said, because I had this feeling already that I'm sure there's things that I would get out of it that I don't know, and it might give me words to be able to put to things that I've already been experiencing.
Right.
But, you learn the lingo, but then unless you're talking to another PMP person, they don't know it, and when you're talking to the client, you can't talk that way.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting you bring this up because when we were doing this presentation, this guy on my team is named Tom Pfeiffer, who helped us out a lot on these slides. So I want to give him some credit. His name's Tom Pfeiffer. He's on my team. In one of the initial slides where we have the project phases, he had it mapped out in the way that we do it, the way it is in the PMP boot camp or the PMI does it. And I said, oh, I don't know that I want to put that here because I think a lot of learning professionals do manage projects, but they're not necessarily keyed into the whole PMP lingo, so I took it out. But yeah, I think it had some benefits, to it, and certainly as you get into bigger scale projects, understanding some of those formalized processes and methodologies can be helpful. So what are some of the potential risks? So I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are some of the risks that we think about along the way, right? Are the SMEs going to be available? I've spoken to a lot of instructional designers. I interview a lot of instructional designers. And one of the first questions I ask instructional designers that we're hiring is, have you had a scenario where the SMEs are not available, and what have you done? So, so that's definitely a big risk. Are they the right SMEs? So sometimes the client gives you a SME who's available. Is the SME really up to date on whatever the content is, or is it somebody who knew the content, 5 years ago, and now he's, in a corner somewhere, doing crossword puzzles, and, what he knew about whatever, or she knew about whatever it was, is kind of antiquated, And are the SMEs responsive? Are they giving what you need in time? Are there issues with the technology that you're integrating your courseware into? In many cases, when we're uploading web-based training into a learning management system, they have a development environment and then they have a production environment. And does the development environment really mirror what's in the production environment? And if they're not the same, well, when you test it in development, it may not be quite the same thing that you get in production. And we didn't really talk about this here, but it is a real key area. Quality assurance is huge. So all along the way, we do peer reviews. We have a quality assurance database. We track errors that we find internally. We track errors that the customer finds. We look for commonalities in terms of some of the quality issues that we see, and we're constantly looking to decrease the kind of quality errors that we see. So that's obviously a real critical part of managing projects. Do we have a question?
Candace wanted to know, how do you deal with SMEs that are not available?
How do you deal with SMEs that are not available? So one of the things we do a couple of different things. Sometimes we have relationships within the organization, and we look for, and I think Rowan Job has presented before to Greg's classes, and I think she's part of your ISD program, right? We look at, are there SMEs that we know of that we can identify so that if the SMEs aren't available, we have some alternative SMEs. The other thing that we do is we try to get a broader base of SMEs, knowing that there might be challenges for them to be available when we need them available. The other thing that we try to do is we try to get as much smart as we can on the content, so we don't need to rely as much on the SMEs as we might have. And part of the thing, too, is you got to really efficiently use that SME time. So SMEs are busy because most of the time they're not being SMEs for you. They're in the mission area, or they're doing whatever they do, right? And so them, providing expertise to you is not their full-time job. So you've got to use their time really wisely. You've got to get smart. You've got to really get in there and use them as efficiently as possible. David, you're going to say something?
Oh, it's important to, when you're working with a SME for the first time, work on developing that relationship. The same way you develop a relationship with a client, you want to do what you can to develop a relationship with a SME so they have a positive experience, because you never know when another course, another project is going to come up, and you have the ability to reach out to the SME again. And if they had a positive experience last time, it's a lot more likely that they would want to be involved the next time. So like Daniel was saying, making sure not to reach out to them when you don't need to, making sure that you're doing as much research as you can, showing them that you're committed to it and you have knowledge, and showing that you're flexible, you're willing to go to where they are, and do whatever you can to really build that relationship.
Absolutely, that's a good point. Is you got to be kind of creative. Going to where they are is kind of an important thing. The other thing is that I would sort of put out there is I've had many situations where you have a customer, and the customer, so when you're thinking about who are the stakeholders, who are the people who are going to be reviewing the things that you're delivering, and the customer says, yeah, this is what I want, and 3/4 through the project, the customer decides to show the in-progress deliverables that you've provided to their boss. And their boss says, this isn't exactly what I was looking for. So it's really important. What I do with my, customers is I'll say, okay, who are, who's the reviewers, who are the stakeholders, and then I'll also say to them, are there people above your level who are going to want to see this? And, I'm not going to say to them, hey, you need your boss to look at this, but what I would say is, do you think it might be helpful for some of these people who are above you? Will they be wanting to see this? If so, do you want us to provide them in the review process? Because you really want to help your customers as good consultants think about who are really the whole network of people who you might want to review this. And with that said, I'm going to also look at it on the other side of things. You don't want necessarily every buddy in the world having a say in this, but at the same token, you want to make sure it's encompassing the right people. We have a question?
William said he has something to add on the topic.
Yes, William.
I think you're going to enjoy this. One of the projects I'm actually managing involves the bank that I work for just got merged into a larger bank back in July of 2010. And both banks had their own accounting systems, which we're converting into more of a web-based, which means that we had a third one that we're dealing with. What had taken place is we developed 6 computer-based training modules on the step-by-step process and different type of derivatives using that web-based product. We gave it to the business. The SMEs said it looked perfect. The stakeholders all agreed it was exactly what they wanted. Then we found out after we got the 6.1 completed and we're starting to work on number 7, number 8, that our technology department decided to reconfigure the entire web-based accounting module, which means we had to throw away the first 6 modules that were signed off on. They did this on their own. They didn't communicate with the training department, nor did they communicate with the business.
Wow.
I'm not proficient in the other language in English, but I became very proficient with French.
So what was the end result of that? You just had to throw them away and restart, or what?
We actually have put a hold on all CBT development because come to find out, they're still messing with it.
Yeah.
We are still going ahead with our instructor-led because we can just basically, because I'm using Snagit for my screenshots, so I can easily basically replace it with the new screenshots.
Yeah.
Which you cannot do with CBTs.
Yeah, and that's gets back to the whole stability of the content, and it sounds like in that situation, if the parties aren't talking to each other, then you're kind of in a hard place. David, you have somebody?
Like when you had a potential risk, I would just say you need to add communication dysfunction amongst business units.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Allie mentioned that prototypes work well for high-level buy-in reviewers.
Yeah, we definitely do prototypes, and I think that's really critical. And I think we had it in the slide, but I think I did not really elaborate on it. But yeah, absolutely, prototypes are really important.
Allie also commented on the point you made about getting the right SME. The client has a tendency to give you the resource they can afford to lose for a while, which sometimes means they are not really on board with the work and changes to it.
Yeah, and that's another key thing that you just mentioned, Allie, is sometimes the SMEs are not necessarily bought into it. They're the SMEs that have been, you're assigned to this, suck it up. And they're not thrilled with it, and sometimes you've got to work with, trying to get their buy-in. And, that can be a challenge too. I mean, techniques we use with that is, I've had SMEs who felt like they were assigned to it and they didn't feel like the customer, the people who are developing the training or the people who were sponsoring it were listening to them, and we tried to sort of say, hey, look, we want to hear your viewpoints, we want to hear your feedback, and we took their feedback back to the sponsoring agents, if you will, and they took in their feedback, and knowing that their feedback mattered, I think, helped get their buy-in. So phase 5 implementation. This is pretty straightforward, getting it into the learning management system. We talked about the pilot feedback. I think we had, we're going to get into this in the next slide, but be sure to let your pilot audience know what they should be looking at during the pilot. If the feedback isn't the right kind of feedback in terms of the feedback, in terms of focusing on the areas that you're looking for, it may not really provide you with much. So you have to be really careful about that, and we're going to talk about that in another slide.
And if you have the ability to be involved in the selection of the pilot audience, it might be helpful for you to at least let them know what you're looking for in the pilot audience. You're not looking for people who just fly through the course and say everything is great, and you also don't want people who are coming in with their own vision. You want to really clearly let them know what you're looking for, make sure that people are coming from either from the content perspective or from an educational perspective, but they should be focused on the right things and not getting through it as quickly as possible or on all the other ways they think the course could be better.
Good. And then the evaluation. How do you measure effectiveness, right? So, formative, summative assessments. Obviously, level 1 assessments are done right after the training. Level 2 is also done right after the training in terms of the assessment, and then obviously level 3 and beyond are done, at different intervals, 6 months, maybe beyond after the training. Can we just go to the next slide? I wanted to. So what I'd like to ask of you guys are, what are some meaningful level 1 evaluation questions? So why don't we start with that one? Anybody have some ideas on what are meaningful level 1 assessment questions? Because I can tell you I've seen a lot of level 1 assessments, and I don't think they're always to the really getting some of the meaningful data that would be helpful. Anyone?
Allie says that it depends on the delivery method. Williams says that SMEs need to be addressed during the kickoff meeting, explaining the value the project will provide. Personally, at the end of the year, when they are compared to their peers, they can use their experience when deciding monetary rewards. Maybe that was for
in response to Allie, I think it was Allie's comment earlier, all those things with the SMEs about their participation, I know it's from that question you mentioned now, but you get it out of the way right at the beginning, and you explain to them this is a way they can differentiate themselves from their peers. And explain to them when their managers are looking, who's going to get that meet standards, went above standards, or exceed standards. When they do these things that are beyond the scope of their daily responsibilities, that's when you get the buy-in. And if they don't buy in at that point, I would not want them on my team, period. And with regards to your evaluation, we do a lot of level 1 where we do multiple choice, but what we normally look for is where we have the ability for them to write in their comments, and that's where we really get to the source if they really liked the class, what part they liked, what part they did not like, and if there's anything that seemed to be quite frequent with the dislikes, we go back and we basically change the course based off the comments that were made.
So one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times the level 1 assessments will be like, did you like the teacher? Was the course, I mean, a good question obviously is, can you apply it back to your job? But also, how are they going to use the training, specifically if it's a web-based training or some form of a blended learning, how are they going to use that training? Are they going to use that training, as a just-in-time training kind of thing, or are they not going to use it? So part of the goal here is, what was the focus, what was the goal of the training? And if the goal of the training was for people to have the training as almost a performance support mechanism, then you've got to sort of understand, are they intending to use it in that way? Because sometimes we build in all these interactive training courses, and some people just want to, depending upon the nature of the content and what's needed, they just want to quickly get to the text and read through the text and not go through all this, animations and interactions. So that's not me saying those things aren't good things to have when it's appropriate and when it makes sense. But I think we also have to look at, how are people going to use the training, and is this really the best mechanism so we have better data to go forward with?
So in essence, some people actually do want the page turner.
Right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes they do. It really depends.
Vivian says she thinks a good question is if the participant expected something from training that wasn't covered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the other question is, how do you determine what post-pilot feedback to implement? So you've done your training, and now you did your pilot, and you're getting your pilot feedback, right? So how do you determine, within the scope of your project now, right? So in your project schedule, you've got a pilot, and you're going to make some pilot changes. And let's say, for example, in your schedule, you've got 2 weeks in the schedule for post-pilot changes. What are you going to do in terms of how are you going to determine which of the feedback that you've gotten you're actually going to implement? Thoughts, anyone? So I can tell you, we look at what are the things you can do within the 2-week period, what are the things that seem within scope. So sometimes what we'll say is we'll bucket the post-pilot changes into 3 buckets. One is, yes, these are the changes we're going to make because we see a common theme from the audience that, yeah, there's a majority of people, we're getting consensus of people saying, the course needs to have X, Y, or Z that it doesn't have, or you didn't get something right based on some of the people in the audience who understand the content. So we'll put in 3 different buckets. Bucket 1 is, yep, we're going to make it. We have time within the schedule, and we're going to make those changes. And one of the assumptions is early on is setting the expectation with your client on what are the kinds of changes you're going to make from the pilot. What are the things that are within scope, what are not, so that when you get these changes, it's very clear to the client what things are going to be able to be done. So you've got bucket 1, what are the changes that you will be able to do? Bucket 2 are, yeah, these are good changes, and we will get to them if we can within the time schedule. And bucket 3 are, these are good changes for future iterations. And I'll have to say there is a 4th bucket. The 4th bucket is, no, we don't think these changes make sense, after you've had discussions with the client and reviewing the feedback. Because somebody may say, I liked the course, but I wasn't crazy that the interface, the navigation bar, had a green background, right? So, I don't know. That may not be one that you're going to necessarily make.
And some points that Allie made is that you can ask the client what gets the biggest bang for their buck, and also trying to differentiate between bugs versus enhancements.
Yep, absolutely. And the next slide is the project closeout, and that's kind of where we talk about, as I mentioned before, what are some short-term, long-term recommendations. We generally have an internal closeout report and an external one. So the internal one is for our team only. What are some lessons learned that we want to keep to ourselves? What are some things that we don't necessarily want to share with the customer? And the others are, what are things that we do want to bring to the customer's attention? What are some of the lessons learned? Like as I mentioned, what are the things we recommend in the long term? Also, it's good to have that lessons learned with the team, your project team. Also, one with your client, but it's really good for your team to talk about what can we take away from this? What have we learned from this? that we're going to do differently next time. And obviously you want to recognize your team. It's really important to recognize their effort. So I think we're at the final slide with questions. I am going to address a question that I got that didn't really fall into the categories that we talked about earlier, and that is a few people asked me, what is it like working for a large consulting firm? So this is how I answered that. I actually like it a lot. I've worked for small firms that are, range from 50 to 100 people, and I work for Booz Allen, which is, I don't know how big they are, how big we are right now. Do you know the number, David? It's probably over 20,000, yes. I would think at this point. I like working for a big firm, and the reason why I like working for this particular firm, and this is not me really sort of doing an advertisement for Booz Allen per se, but I like the idea that I have a corporate reach back, that if I want to get support from other groups within the organization on, hey, how have you experienced doing X, Y, or Z, or do you have some intellectual capital on how to do, simulations or serious gaming? I have that ability to reach into a big organization and find people who have that experience and that expertise. But at the same time, I feel like I have a bit of latitude within my own team and the local area that I work in to kind of do my thing and have some flexibility and build our own kind of, for lack of a better word, branding. Our own sort of identity within the bigger scale of a company. So I feel like I have the best of both worlds. So I feel kind of fortunate with that. Any questions, thoughts? Did we cover things that are relevant for you? You don't have to tell me now. You can tell Greg, but we would like to know. It's always good to know whether this is helpful or not, whether we're on target with things that are of interest and are relevant, or whether we're just sort of hitting it out of bounds and not really relevant.
Daniel, I have a question.
Yes.
Would you mind talking, because people ultimately ask me this, but I always like to hear it coming from your perspective and David's perspective as well. The biggest reason people go into our program here at UMBC is that they want this to help their career. So it's a means to an end. They want to either get a job, a better job, a more interesting job, work for a better employer, etc. What does Booz look at when they look at prospective people from the learning and professional development fields?
Sure. So I think we look at a combination of three areas, that just sort of come to my mind. One is we look at your functional skills, right? So how well do you understand, instructional systems design, what the ADDIE model really is, not just the acronym. Do you understand, instructional system design, the whole functional component of what you guys are doing? So we look at that. The other thing that we look at is, do you have, a fair amount of flexibility and adaptability? So, one of the interesting things about instructional design from my perspective is, you're in so many different scenarios. You're in the scenario where you're developing for different types of delivery mediums. You're in scenarios where you're working with different clients. So you're inevitably a consultant because you need to be a consultant in doing these things. And you're also doing learning solutions in different fields, right? So it might be we're doing training on laws It might be training on how to use a system, and it might be training on, what does an analyst or a linguist or somebody else need to do. So you're constantly having to become, you're never going to be an expert in the different, fields that you're providing training on, but you have to be sort of a mini expert, a little bit of an expert. So you have to have some level of understanding. So we look for people who have a fair amount of flexibility and adaptability, because you're in those different kinds of scenarios. And then we also sort of look at, I would say cultural fit. So Booz Allen, I think you were looking for people who are collaborative, people who sort of think a little bit outside of the box. And it depends on where you are in your career. So what I look for somebody who's, more junior, who hasn't had a huge amount of work experience, is different than what I look for somebody who's been in the work world and done this for a while. So, somebody who's more experienced, I'm going to ask them, okay, how have you dealt with different kinds of situations and, the problem solving? And just like what we went through in this exercise, what do you do in a situation? And we look for people who are thinking about that not just what the easy answer is, but what are some of the possibilities and what are, the pros and cons of those possibilities, so that customers have the right kinds of data points and information to make good decisions, because ultimately the people we bring on to the firm are going to be ultimately those people who are interacting with those customers. David, do you want to? Yep.
Well, William wanted to know if you had a Six Sigma certification.
Six Sigma certification. I think there is a Six Sigma, I believe, certification within the firm, but I don't know all the details. I'd have to get back to you on that. So if you were to shoot us off an email, I'd be happy to, either David or myself, to look into what we have related to that. Anyone else? And we didn't put our email addresses on the screen, but we can certainly get that. Greg has our email address, so I'm happy to take emails.
Yes, I do.
David, yeah, so feel free to give out our email address. I'm happy to answer, questions or things after this. Anybody else have any questions?
Great opportunity to ask a top-notch consulting firm, folks.
Let's not get carried away here.
Well, hey, it's free, too.
Yeah, it's free. It is free. So, by the way, while you guys are thinking of any questions that you have, I would like to say, it's always a pleasure to present to Greg's class. I think you guys have had some real thoughtful questions and input into this. And I was saying to Greg before we did this, we're constantly, relooking at how we're managing our projects and lessons learned. So it was actually a good opportunity to put this together for you guys, because it made us relook at what we're doing and sort of think about, some of the things we're talking about internally to our task leads and project leads. But it's been a pleasure. Anybody else have any questions, thoughts?
And Greg, I just wanted to let you know that I was actually in this class, maybe it was a year ago as a student, so it was enjoyable being on the other end this time around.
Okay, well, good. And we always have Booz hire some of our graduates, too, so.
We've hired several people. I have several people on my team who have come out of this program, and I can honestly say they've all been consistently very, very good.
Well,
this is Allie. I have a question, and you can't really answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What about, when you look at companies like this, like for people who are in their second or third career,
yeah.
Changing and when you're interviewing and looking at people, you can't not hire them because of ageism.
Right.
But does it come up? you know, like how long you're going to have them in your workforce, and you know what I mean? So like I'm just thinking about myself. I like where I am and where I'm working, but if I were to think about changing, you know, I already know I've been in the corporate world before, and you know, people are not going to be interested in hiring me.
Well, you know, you know, I'm going to be totally honest with you. If I interview somebody and, you know, we have certain rights, so on certain contracts we have, as you probably know, Allie, there are labor category requirements. So on a contract it may say, okay, you have these labor categories, right, instructional designer 1, 2, or 3, and these are the years of experience somebody needs, and there's a rate, right, a dollar amount rate that's associated in some contracts. Not all contracts have these sort of specific labor categories and specific rates. But if I interview somebody and they meet the qualifications, I really don't care about their age. You know, and I don't think Booz Allen typically does. You know, I mean, you know, we have, and this isn't, you know, I'm not really here to be doing this huge Booz Allen plug. I mean, obviously, it's helpful. We've had a great relationship with UMBC and the ISD graduate program, and we've brought people on, and that's been great. But it's great for, you know, it's great for me because I like to sort of be hearing what people are doing and different perspectives, because we don't have all the answers. I'll be the first to tell you that. And we are constantly, as David could tell you, we're constantly changing. I'm constantly looking for different ways to do things, and sometimes we'll change it, and sometimes it's not the right thing, but ultimately that's the goal. But, you know, I think within Booz Allen we have these core values, and we're pretty serious about it, and so we're pretty serious about, you know, not having a bias in these kinds of areas. So if people have the capabilities and they fit in terms of the cultural fit, and they fit in terms of their qualifications, and they seem like they're a good fit for our team, that's enough. I mean, I could hire somebody who's, right, 25 years old. That doesn't mean they're going to be here for another year. They're going to, you know, they may, you know, I could make the same generalization about, you know, people who are in their 20s and say, well, I could look at statistics and see people in their 20s don't typically stay at one place more than a couple of years until they reach a certain age. I mean, we don't look at all those kinds of things. The bottom line is, you know, we want good people who have good capabilities. And, you know, I'm fortunate on our team, and, you know, that we've got a lot of different people, and those different perspectives are really helpful, because I can tell you, whether it's our graphic artists, our instructional designers, or our programmers, it's everybody has different skills and different capabilities that are their strong suits. So some people are really good. I'm going to give you an example. Our graphic artists are really good at doing illustrations. Other people are really good at 3D modeling. Other people are really good at video. And you know what? Having those different perspectives and those different kinds of skill sets allows us to provide a better solution. I don't know, David, you could sort of talk about, you know.
Yeah, I mean, just as a member of Daniel's team, I mean, pretty much everything Daniel said. It is a diverse team. There are some younger folks, there's some older folks, but it's a large team, and I think everybody appreciates the diversity, the degree of experience that different people have, the different knowledge and expertise that people have, and it's just kind of a known thing in the team that everybody knows, oh, you have a question on this thing, go to so-and-so. You have a question on this thing, go to the other person. And having that large group of people, that diverse group of people that you can go to for different things is definitely appreciated.
Yeah, and I think our leadership actually likes it. When they go into a room and they see that it's not homogeneous, you know, I think they like that, to be honest with you. Next question.
Thanks for the candid answer. Thanks. I appreciate.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, go ahead.
Oh, William just said Booz Allen has a very good reputation in our industry.
Oh, that's good. Anybody else? Well, I know it's your last class, so I feel pretty fortunate to be at the last class. I actually picked the last class, hoping Greg would accept that, so I could procrastinate getting this together as long as I could. But it's also nice because it's your last class, so I'm hoping that we're leaving your last class on a positive note and a positive experience. But anyway, I know it's 8:19, so if you guys want to close it up for us, that's fine too.
And Rolanda just mentioned she works for Booz Allen and that she loves it.
Oh, good. Greg?
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, and I know a lot of people have already chatted in saying great presentation, loved it, et cetera. So thank you very much. And this was, I think a great evening because, you've worked with so many different clients on such a large scale, which a lot of people don't do. So I think your practical experience is really helpful for us, including myself, to see because it's just invaluable experience. There aren't 29 Booz Allens out there. Of course, you have competition, but there aren't a lot of 20,000 consulting companies out there. So I really appreciate you taking your time to share with us. So thank you very much. Hope we can do it again, gentlemen.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And good luck, everybody, with your
All right, class. I will just keep you on line here shortly. Your projects, your second project is due, of course, as you know. And what I will do is I will get the grades in probably within the next 3 or 4 business days. I believe they're due, I want to say Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. So I don't have any concerns with people's performance. If I did, you would know it by now. So the only place where people get into problems sometimes is if they didn't submit something. And I usually am pretty good about giving people the benefit of the doubt. So if you haven't submitted anything that you need to submit, please get it in as soon as possible so I can give you full credit where credit is due. Any questions from anyone?
Hey, Greg. Allie here. I had a little comment, just as a little aside. I wanted to do the RFP thing, and I had asked around in my agency for examples to try to look at, and then I found that there weren't any.
Okay.
So I decided to create a little guide, which was what I submitted. And it turned out today, one of the people that I had asked for information that didn't have any sent me an email today saying, did I ever follow up on that and create anything for RFPs? Because she has to submit one today and she needs help. So I sent her the guide, and she